Now we move on to lesson 5, which is our trimming lesson. We load in the O2 Trim Rough Cut. And to begin, you start off by customizing the layout. A lot of this will be identical to the previous version of the book. So once we load the O2 Trim Rough Cut, the next thing you want to do is move into customizing the layout. You'll start by hiding the media pool, then you'll go over to switch to a single over on the right hand side, switch to a single viewer mode. Then we'll come over and we'll increase the size of the viewer just by coming in between the toolbar and the transport controls and dragging down a little bit just to make this larger. And then we can save this as like a trim layout. So you'll come up to your workspace and choose layout presets, and you'll just save it as a big trim or whatever you want to call it. So we'll start off with the very first clip at the beginning of our timeline. We'll position our playhead and we'll play it, and we'll see that there's a big gap there. You can use the waveform to see that there's no audio there as well. You might want to zoom in a little bit if you want to. And now we can position our playhead to where just before he begins speaking, and we can talk about the easiest way to trim is just going up to the trim menu and choosing trim start, and they can see the keyboard shortcut here. And you can talk about this being called a tops and tails kind of trim. A lot of people come from a broadcast background will use this just to position the playhead where you want to trim, and choose trim start, and it will trim the beginning. And then we can talk about there being a gap here, which isn't really what we wanted to do. What we want to do is trim it but have everything move up to still start at the hour 1 time position. So what we're going to do is we're going to undo that. So you kind of do it incorrectly first. And then what we're going to talk about is coming over to the toolbar and choosing the trim tool. And the difference between the trim tool is that it will ripple trim versus the selection tool, which just does a normal trim. And so now when we choose to trim start, it's going to pull up the tracks and close the gap. Then we're going to go to the end of this clip. I'm going to stay on the same clip and play it.
The real world.
And instead of this last line,
how the airplane is connecting and making all the
we end on the real world.
And shoot the real world.
And again, you can see the gap right there. Our playhead's in the right position. We're going to again do it incorrectly first. We're going to still stay on the trim tool because we want everything to ripple up. We're going to go to trim, and then we're going to choose to trim end. But watch what happens to the music track on audio 2. That gets truncated as well, and we don't want that to happen. So we're going to undo that, and this is where you start to talk about these auto select buttons, and we'll turn off auto select on audio 2 for the music, so that won't be that won't participate in this trim end when we do it. So we'll trim end again, and now the audio on the music track is left alone. Remember to turn auto select back on when you are done with that. So we trim start, we trim end, and then we talk about ripple trimming more with the trim tool. We'll go to the Maldives clip is the first one here that we're going to trim. Again, you can zoom in if you like to see it a little bit closer, but when you play over it, you'll see that the plane starts already in the frame, and you want to make sure that it's out of the frame when you do that. So we're just going to click it, and you'll talk about this icon here and how we hover over the beginning of it. You can see that the icon is pointing towards the head of this clip, the start of this clip, and when we click down, it selects it. Green is on one side, and if we start to trim, you can drag to the left to add frames to the beginning. And you want to talk about what you're seeing up above, the split being the last frame on the left of the outgoing shot and the first frame on the right in the incoming shot. And you can see as we trim, you'll see that frame update. So we're just going to back up until the plane is just out of the frame. We're not going to do it any more than that, because then you're going to teach them how to trim using number values. So if I just wanted to add more to the head going to the left, right, it's going to be a negative number, and we're just going to type in -1 period enter. You can talk about period being the same as 00, so you don't have to type the 00. So you're just going to enter in -1 period to add 1 second to the beginning of this. And then you can talk about how the period and the comma keys will nudge that point 1 frame at a time. Comma and period nudging 1 frame or another. And then you can play over it, right? So you can use that
It was possible to shoot it. We wanted to go shoot it.
/ button just to review that cut point.
It was possible to shoot it. We wanted to go shoot it.
Now you're going to go into your next trim, which is going to be the Milky Way clip. This is going to be the ability to select the tracks that you want to trim. So we're going to come over between the Milky Way and the O2 clip. So I'm just going to zoom out of this using my Shift Z. I'm going to come over to this Milky Way clip, and in between the last interview clip that you see there, and I'm going to zoom in. And I'll just play over this cut point.
It's really important. Every shot.
And you can talk about overlaps, how instead of doing straight cuts like this, you might want to have his voice come in as the Milky Way is still on screen. If you did that trimming right now and you select the head, it's going to select the picture and sound together. So you need a way to not select picture and sound together, and they already know how to do this. It's this link selection, and now you can select just the picture and you can start to trim it. And when you start to trim it to the right, you'll take off frames from the beginning of this and point out what happens to the audio. The audio doesn't trim, it just moves over it so that they can stay in sync. And then when you play it back,
it's really important.
If you want, it's always nice to undo it and show them what happens when the auto select buttons are disabled for the audio. So you turn it off just on audio, and now when you trim this, you can see that they go out of sync. It's nice just to show them what happens, and it kind of reinforces what these auto select buttons are doing, because that's the stuff that's really the auto selects are really what's causing this to stay in sync and causing this audio to shift over to the left as you trim, and then you can hear it.
It's really important. Every shot was original.
Okay, and make sure that you turn on the link selection again. The next thing that you do is you do the opposite side of this cut and you do a roll trim. So you go to the opposite side of the cut and you kind of talk about the icons again. You have the tail and the head, and when you're directly over, you have a double selection for a roll trim. So you can select the roll trim. If you didn't want to select picture and sound, instead of going all the way up to the link button, you can tell them again about the option key, which will select kind of temporarily turn off this link selection button. So holding on the option or alt key, you're able to just select the picture, and then you can just roll in, and you can see how nothing is breaking sync, nothing is shifting around. You're just shifting this cut point earlier just a little bit, so the last line, you can see the waveform, that last line is over the Bay Area clip, and then you can play it back.
Important. Every shot was original and that everything was real.
Right. So that's the roll trim that you do. The next thing you do is you go into slipping clips, and for this one we go over to the beginning of the timeline, so you can just scroll to the beginning again, and it's this one here, this takeoff shot, and you can see if you play through it, it starts okay. It's a little long on the start, and then you never see it take off. So what you'd like to do is keep it in the same location, but just change where it begins and ends. So you can talk about how the icons again, trim the head, trim the tail, trim a roll trim. But when you're over the thumbnails, you'll get a slip cursor, and you can click and you can start dragging. And then you have to explain the heads up display. What you're seeing up above, you're seeing the head and the tail of the clip that you're slipping up above, and then you're seeing the last frame of the outgoing shot, the previous shot down in the lower left, and the first frame of the incoming shot in the lower right. So those aren't going to change, just the top two. And there's a nice visual in the timeline as well. You can see the white outline showing you the handles, and you can see the thumbnails actually slipping in the clip. So we're just going to drag it to the left until the plane is totally out of the frame. You can use the upper right viewer to make sure of that, and then you can let go, and then you can drag through it. Now your plane ends off the screen. The next thing you do is you trim with the selection tool trimming. So we're going to go over to the Milky Way. I'm just going to scroll down here. You have this very long Milky Way. We're going to switch back to the selection tool, right? And I'm going to come in and I'm just going to trim just by shortening the Milky Way 4 seconds, just click on the head and open up a gap. So this is the difference between the selection tool and the trim tool. I'm going to trim off about 4 seconds here so you can use that tooltip. Now we need to move on and fill this gap. So you're going to talk about positioning your playhead in between the 2 clips in the gap, and you're going to mark clip. You can tell them about underneath the mark menu. There's mark clip, and show them that it's just X. So that's an easy shortcut. You can just hit X and you'll be able to mark clip, right? Now our clip, you can see, isn't marking the whole thing. It's marking the whole timeline here because the audio track. So the first thing you want to make sure that you're doing is turning off these auto selects. Now mark clip with just the video auto select on. So now you can mark that section right there. So now we have an in and an out in our timeline. I'm going to switch back to my dual viewer because I do need to see my media pool and my dual viewers there. So I'm going to switch back. I'm going to go into my B-roll bin. I need to get another shot here. So what I'm going to do is go up to my Kenya plane 07. This is the shot we're going to fill that gap with. I'm just going to start when this somewhere, again, it's pretty arbitrary where you start, but I use where this plane is kind of pointing, the reflection pointing straight up. That's going to be my mark in point. I don't need an out point because I have my range marked in the timeline. And then I'm going to hit the overwrite button, and you can see we've filled in that gap. Now what we do is we talk about trimming in the source viewer itself. So when we are on this clip here, maybe we want it to last because the yellow plane just comes on screen but cuts out too early. But you don't really know what is beyond this frame. So you can double click and now you're able to see the in and out points. And you'll see what comes after, and we'd like to include this section. So now you can talk about when you double clip, what it's loading is this actual clip in the timeline. It's loading into the source viewer. It's not going to the bin and getting this clip. That's a match frame. This is loading the clip from the timeline, and you can see the name of the clip above there says the name of the clip plus the name of the timeline, so you know that it's different than a match frame, which is just loading the source clip. So now if I modify this out point here, and you can do it in a number of different ways. You can mark a new one, or you can actually just come over and drag it, and you can see what's happening in the timeline. Dragging is a little bit more visual. You have to be a little bit precise to click and drag on that out point, but if you are, it's a little bit more visual to see what's happening. And you can just drag it a little bit until maybe the flamingos are halfway down, right, into the frame, and see what's happening there in the timeline, that it overwrites this Milky Way because we're on the selection tool. The last thing you do here in this section is you go into sliding a clip. And for this, you can come over to the Kenya clip. You're just going to use the same clip. If you're on the selection tool, just like you have trim the head, trim the tail, the roll trim, the slip cursor, if you move over the name, the blue bar where the name is, that's going to be a slide cursor, and you're able to move this clip back and forth in the timeline. Just slide it along. You can tell them about the viewers up above, the quad split that they're looking at. Sometimes you have to switch to the selection tool and say, if you dragged this with the selection tool, you're going to be opening up gaps. But if you select the trim tool and you slide it, there are no gaps opening. So you're trimming both sides of the outgoing and the incoming shot to make sure that the gaps are closed up. And that's the end of this section for lesson 5.